Hi, friends, and welcome to Igniting Imagination. I'm your host, Lisa Greenwood, and joining me is my co host for this season, Reverend Kathi McShane. Hi, Kathi.
Hi, Lisa. Good to be with you again.
And you. So, this is our third episode of our season in which we are exploring themes that will be essential to the future church, and they are happening right now. This is the now and not yet of the church today. In our first episode, we considered hospitality. In our second episode, we discussed power, and today we are digging into place with our friends Reverend Bill Lamar and the Reverend Dr. Reggie Blount. So, in season 11 of our podcast, we interviewed our most recent class of Locke Innovative Leaders. And if you haven't heard that season, please do go back and listen. It's so good. And earlier this year, we hosted a large in person gathering where we heard each Locke Innovative Leader share a 15-minute TED style talk. In this current season of our podcast, we are looking at themes that emerged at that gathering. What we experienced at the center of each talk was love, specifically love for the place and the people in that place where they live and engage in ministry. They ultimately innovate because they love the people they are in community with. This idea of going local or the power of place is not new. We've talked about it a good bit on our podcast already, and we're going to keep talking about it because it keeps coming up again and again. Local contextual ministry is a means of grace now and for the future flourishing of people, congregations, and communities. This conversation with Bill and Reggie invites us even deeper into the theme. Kathi, will you share their brief bios?
Reverend William H. Lamar IV is the pastor of the Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C. He has served before Turner Memorial AME Church in Maryland and 3 other churches in Florida. He's been a managing director at the Leadership Education at Duke Divinity. He's a graduate of Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University and Duke Divinity School. Bill is the co-host of a podcast called Can These Bones, sponsored by Faith and Leadership. And he's also the author of a book that's coming out this fall called Ancestors, which I'm really excited to read. It's his own story, I think, as well as a theological reflection on the power of those who came before us. Reverend Dr. Reggie Blount serves on the faculty of Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary, where he is Associate Professor of Formation, Leadership, and Culture. And he teaches in the areas of Christian education, congregational leadership, and youth and young adult ministry. Reggie's the program director of the Garrett Young Adult Initiative, and he serves as advisor for the DMIN program in strategic leadership in Black congregations. Reggie's also the co-founder and executive director of the Oikos Institute, which helps congregations harness the power of their assets in order to be a catalyst for community transformation and economic renewal. They're both extraordinarily accomplished leaders. So it's really wonderful to be with them.
They're so amazing, and they have, especially in the last couple of years, really impacted our work. And so I loved being in the space with them and really talking about place. So, Kathi, what stood out to you in this conversation?
They were both sort of exquisitely conscious about their place in the world,
Yes.
really sort of deeply and reflectively thoughtful about the place each of them occupies, not only physically, but in an ecosystem. And
Mm-hmm.
out of that, both of them drew these sort of new and quite subtle theological insights, it seems
Mm-hmm.
to me. And both of them have the capacity to put those insights into what were to me moving and inspirational words. So I'm really excited for people to hear this conversation. How about you, Lisa?
Yes.
What did you hear?
So I I really was struck at how important place is for the Black church, and both of them coming out of the AME tradition, deeply Wesleyan. This notion that John Wesley said, "The world is my parish," and talking about how the Black church has taken that literally, like the community is the place for ministry. That interconnectedness that happens in a community is actually vital to the work of the Black church. And you see evidence of that. But it was really powerful to hear them talk about it and how there's a kind of an intentional learning from the space, to learn from your context, your piece of real estate that is your mission field. Anyway, it was such a deep and profound and moving and inspiring conversation. So let's hear from Bill and Reggie. So, we're going to jump into our theme today, which is the power of place. And we have phenomenal guests with us. Reggie, it is so good to be with you.
Thank you, Lisa. It's great to be with y'all and to be a part of this conversation.
Yeah. And Bill, thank you for joining us. So good to be with you.
Lisa, I'm honored to join you all. Thank you for the opportunity here.
Well, Kathi and I've really been looking forward to this, and I want to jump right in, and really kind of begin to look at this concept of the power that place has in how we do ministry and how it's shifting. And so I want to start just by asking y'all, what are two or three places that you've experienced in your life that have taught you something about the power of place?
I can start. Two places that quickly come to mind is the campus of Tuskegee University,
Hmm.
uh, its rich history, um, the opportunity to be authentic uh, in who I am, uh, the opportunity to learn from people who look like me
Hmm.
was an exciting, uh, exhilarating time uh, when I did my undergrad at Tuskegee University. To know that this was the place that Booker T. Washington cultivated,
Hmm.
and to and in the time that I was there to experience such many exemplary folk who came through that campus. Um, it's definitely served as a great place for me to be and to grow. The second is where I just left last week, Alex
Hmm.
Haley's farm. That is owned by the Children's Defense Fund. Um, each year around this time, what is now called the Hall Proctor Institute for Child Advocacy Ministry Conference is held at Alex Haley's farm. And the greeting that is offered when we come to Haley is welcome home. And it feels like home every time that we are there in Clinton, Tennessee. And all of the folk who come and are a part of that conference, it's life giving.
It's always a challenge to have to speak behind Reginald. I'll do my best. For me, I think about home And home for us most immediately, for me and those in my lineage, is Middle Georgia, the central region of the state of Georgia, specifically Bibb County, Macon, my home, and Jones County, from where my paternal line originated. And what we talk about in Middle Georgia is the red clay. It is, the soil is marked by a red clay. And spending time in Georgia around that red clay, you always know when you're there, because the red clay marks your shoes as well as your soul. And so for me, my soul is marked by the red clay of Georgia in ways blessed and in ways that are bedeviling. My soul is marked in ways that lift up what is marvelous about human beings, and in the words of the great poet Seamus Heaney, what is murderous about human beings. And so I am marked by that space, in that tension and liminal space and luminosity between what is best in us and what is worst in us. And for me also, and my friend and colleague Reggie Blount shares this experience. We're pastors. And so all of the churches that I have known, St. Paul AME Church, 989 Morrow Avenue, Macon, Georgia. Bethel AME Church, 501 West Orange Avenue, Tallahassee, Florida. The churches that I have served, St. Philip African Methodist Episcopal Church in Monticello, Florida. Greater St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church, 1040 Paramore Avenue in Orlando, Florida. New Bethel AME Church, 1201 Tyler Street in Jacksonville, Florida. The Turner Memorial AME Church in Hyattsville, and now Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church, located at 1518 M Street Northwest, which is the oldest continuously owned parcel of property by persons of African descent in the capital of the American Empire. All of these spaces speak to a culture and a people who wanted to be in consort and in consultation with the divine and one another in ways that were life-giving and other affirming. And I, being their progeny, am heir to this extraordinary spiritual heritage. And when I talk about spirit, spirit is never separate from the physical, because the word spirit means breath, it means wind. So their spirit work and body work center me and center us. So in those churches and in the soil, the red clay of Georgia, I find home, and I'm shaped by those places.
Gosh, you all have brought up beautiful images and some themes here that I think are so important to how we understand place in our lives. Like this, you're talking about place, not just where you are in this moment, but all the history and the ancestry and what that those stories and lives lived do to shape us today. So place has a role in formation. That's what I'm hearing you say, and how we're formed. And then I want to pick up on this, the kind of spiritual aspect of this, of course, right? And both of you are AME pastors, and so I want to look into that a little bit. And what does the AME tradition have to say to us? What can we learn from the AME tradition about the power of place?
I'll let Bill go first.
That's great. That's awesome.
This way I get to sound smarter. If I go first, I'll sound smarter. I'll go first because Reggie will. But if you read the work of Richard Newman, who wrote a biography of Richard Allen called Freedom's Prophet, he talks about the early theological formation. Now, I think that mistakenly we talk about the founding of the AME Church as a reaction to being excluded. but that's not the Genesis. The Genesis of the church is a melding. It is a wedding between African traditions, African cosmological and theological traditions, and what Richard Allen and the early ancestors experienced here. What I tell people, when you come to Metropolitan, we have African deities on display in the sanctuary because we believe in indigeneity. We do not believe in the Christian impulse to crush what came before, to crush traditions, to crush ways of knowing God. What I tell people is that we knew God before there were churches or Bibles, and God knew us. And so the African Methodist Episcopal tradition wove together. So he talks beautifully about Allen and other enslaved humans. After they had worked, they would have come together and told stories and shared. And what was told and shared came with them from when they were able to dance in the light of freedom. And they wed together what they knew with what they experienced into an innovation that is separate and apart from what American Christians were doing. It is a separate tradition. It is a new innovation on the Christ story, on the Christ, on incarnation, ministry, death, resurrection, and ascension that is steeped like good collard greens and good meat in a seasoning that yields something that tastes different and that is different. And so for us, place informs spirituality because we brought with us something that was added to what was here, which really was our affirmative. It is not a reaction to anything that was done to us, but our affirmative assertion as to who we are theologically and who we were. I tell people when I tour people around the church often, I say the difference between Metropolitan and the National Cathedral is the National Cathedral was founded as an exclusionary house of worship. Metropolitan was always open to every human being filled with God's breath. And that's the innovation that we bring in time and space that is rooted in the soils that gave birth to us.
Oh, it's so powerful to me that you're using this word innovation because the best of innovation is deeply rooted in identity and uh, and even tradition. And I don't mean tradition in sort of an oppressive way, but in a kind of indigenous way, right? And so innovation is not just sort of this change thing, but it's deeply rooted. And so the way you're describing that, like it's in your bodies, in your identity, in your community. Anyway, beautiful. Thank you, Bill. Reggie, you're nodding. I'd love to hear your thoughts and what's going on.
Well, ditto to all that Bill has said. And what I would add is that the African Methodist Episcopal Church did not was not birthed out of doctrinal conflict. It emerged out of the free African society that saw or strived to see the sacred worth of persons of African descent who found themselves in Philadelphia and formed a benevolent society to meet the needs of people. So dare I say, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, in connecting to Methodism, took Methodism seriously. That they saw that it wasn't just about the individualistic needs of one particular congregation, but truly took the thoughts of Wesley at its word, that the world is our parish. And so it is a church that for the most part really strives to minister to the community for which it is planted. And so when we talk about place, and what we have experienced throughout the history and contemporary times, for many of our African Methodist Episcopal churches, It's understanding that we have a responsibility to those who are quote unquote members of the congregation, but we also have a responsibility to the community that God has entrusted to us. And that guides our ethos.
What I hear in what both of you have said is you're talking about not only the practicalities of a place, but the spirit of a place. And that somehow the work of being in that place, the work and the joy of it, I would say, is about catching, understanding, internalizing that spirit that almost like it rises out of the ground. The way you talked about the Haley Farm, Reggie, and Bill, what I've seen in Metropolitan Church, in your church, it is like it's like you can absorb yourself in it, and I wonder if that is part of what you do as a leader in those places, is to see and understand and maybe interpret the spirit of that place.
One of the things that one of my teachers is leading us, it's a group of us doing ancestral work at the intersection of the ancestral and theological. The ancestral is theological. I mean, the way that I heard people pray growing up was God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. That is a way of saying that God cannot be separated from those who have come before. That God is revealed through them. And so one of the African tenets of knowing is that objects have personhood. Not only do human beings have personhood, but objects too. Objects are to be respected, and objects are to be learned from and to be revered. And the church itself, I mean, Kathi, when you came and others have come, there is an energy to the place that teaches the one who would listen. And so what I share with people who come is that architecture is a form of rhetoric. Any sign, symbol, or language that communicates is rhetorical. And when you step outside of Metropolitan and you view the space, you have to ask yourself, what is the rhetoric of this architecture? What does this say about the people who built this in the 1880s? Well, clearly, the grandeur with which they experienced the divine and the grandeur they detected in themselves was not what society thought of them. They built a space that says, this is the grandeur of the divine. This is the glory of human beings made in their image, made in the divine image. And what we can do is offer a theological and ecclesial reality in contradistinction to the imperial theology that grips this city and the majority of denominations, Christians here in the United States. So it is all tied into space and place. And what I tell people is, even for those who do not believe that objects have personhood, they don't say that they believe it, but they do. Because if you walk around Washington, D.C., you see the buildings, the shrines, the monuments, the personhood of those objects is meant to communicate the power of the American imperial ideal. And that is exactly what it does. There is a spirituality connected to that. And so what I try to do is to get beyond and beneath what people are not saying, to see that the African understanding that objects have personhood. People will say, oh, that's animist, that's this, that's that. But it is clearly the way that people are thinking when they create space. They want it to teach generations to come.
Wow, wow. I'm reminded of Susan Beaumont's work around the soul of an institution, and that it needs tending. And I'm so struck by this notion that, and I think you're spot on here. As much as we're using property differently and we're able to Zoom and don't have to be in person, there's just nothing like being in a room together, or being in a sanctuary, being in a holy space. And we know that, and we're a little more in tune with that. But I think it's very challenging what you've said about how we, even if we say we don't, um, believe that objects and buildings have personhood, we sure act as if they do. I mean, and we construct our systems in ways that uh, belie our true um, feelings about that. So interesting. I want to talk a little bit about um, this kind of an increased focus on neighborhoods. I think the conversation in the church has is increasing around what it means to be a neighbor and to be in the neighborhood. There's increased focus on collaboration in our neighborhoods. Where does this intersect with the conversation about the power of place? Are we talking about a similar thing here? Are we? How does this conversation intersect with this notion of a renewed commitment to neighborhood?
So, um, I think we can enter into this conversation in a variety of ways. I would first say when I think about your question, it's again it presupposes as if this is something new. Um, when I
Fair.
think in the Gospels, Jesus says that in the Great Commandment to love God with everything that you have and to love your neighbor as yourself. Lawyer says, so who is my neighbor? We talk about the Good Samaritan story. Go and then go and do likewise. So this notion of being neighbor and neighborhoods are not new. Uh, I go a step further and say that persons of African descent, um, particularly in ways that we have been segregated in this country, and when you look at immigrant populations, we've always had neighborhoods. So and in those neighborhoods we figured out some level of interdependence. We figured out how with limited resources to be of help and support to one another. So neighborhoods are not new. The challenge of neighborhoods right now, I think, is um, uh, the lack of resources in many of those neighborhoods to be able to flourish in ways that neighborhoods have and can continue to flourish. And so, if we can get back to, if there's anything to get back to, it's getting back to recognizing that we're not that the great part of neighborhoods is a great demonstration of a more collective socialization than an individualistic socialization. Um, and if we recognize that we need one another, that begins the move back toward, if there's a moving back, um, toward neighborhoods really flourishing.
You're doing some significant work through Oikos with congregations. I'd love to hear you follow up with that just last bit with what you're learning through Oikos, and tell us a little bit about it so folks know what you're doing, and then um, and what are you learning from it?
So, shameless plug. I'm the executive
Please.
director of a young nonprofit called the Oikos Institute for Social Impact, and our commitments are to help congregations who are serving in under-resourced communities to harness the power of their assets, using a model that my co-founder framed called Fish, and is helping congregations recognize that along with the financial capital that they have through tithes, offerings, and other kinds of financial resources, that that oftentimes is not enough to do the kind of mission they feel called to do, that they have other resources that are available to them intellectual capital, which is the I, social capital, which is the S, that leads to the thriving of human capital, which is the H. And what we are finding is congregations who earnestly want to be an agent of transformation in their community, but if we're honest, they too have been shaped by a much more individualistic socialization, and so congregations tend to work out of a silo context or mentality. The feeling that that it has to be done, that we're the ones that have to figure out how to do it, and not recognize that there are opportunities out, both inside and outside their congregations, where collaborative partnership and the development of a stronger ecosystem really can take place. We are also striving to help these congregations connect to funders and other resources to, again, strengthen that ecosystem, to know that they don't have to try to do this work. As a matter of fact, they're not even called to do this work by themselves, but that as they develop strong collaborative partnerships, transformation can take place.
Yeah, right there in their neighborhood. Yeah, yeah. Bill, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this notion of neighborhood and place, and the place of the church. And I mean, you have alluded to it just in terms of where you're located, right there in DC, and what that means. But yeah, what are you thinking about this?
Thank you for the question. I begin Christologically. So I think about the scandal of particularity in the incarnation of Christ. The Christ event is extraordinarily particular. We preach and believe that God becomes flesh in this one North African human being who is a peripatetic prophet, healer, and exorcist. One human being from one small, politically and militarily insignificant people. And we build a whole theology around the belief that God enters the world in this one person and culture. We have to do a full stop there. What some people who have read and translated again John 1 say is that God became flesh and moved into the neighborhood and pitched a tent among us. So the way that God works is always scandalously particular. Scandalously particular. I want to wed that to what Toni Morrison talks about when she talks about her literature. And people asked her, why don't you write about white people? And she said, nobody asked James Joyce that. Why don't you write about black people? Nobody asked Shakespeare or Faulkner. So her assertion was that from the particularity of black humanity, humanity can learn what it means to be human. Every culture offers that from within its own particularity. So if we take that theological principle and understand that God is particularly, radically, offensively involved in the local and the particular and the infinitesimal of human granular life, then we realize the church exists symbiotically with what surrounds it. What I remember thinking about this years ago, and there's new scholarship, scientific scholarship, about the intelligence of plants. And I would argue, reading some of it, plants are smarter than we are in some ways. The scholars are saying, if you look at thousands of oak trees, there is a way to consider that these are not individual oak trees, but one organism that shares nutrition, trees warn one another when fires are coming. If there's a weak tree, they send nutrients to nourish. What neighborhoods do in their particularity is learn, nurture our stories so that we can thrive together. I think one of the problems with people who do what I do, and I probably am as guilty as others, is we're looking for national fame. We are looking for everybody to know who we are. We're looking for platforms. We celebritize. I just made that word. We celebritize the local work of being. And what we need to understand is this: people know because he was an extraordinary pastor to people in Montgomery. People know who Fannie Lou Hamer was because she was an extraordinary lover of the people in Sunflower County, Mississippi. Love the people where you are, and God will do the rest because God believes in the local. Like everybody now talks about eating local and buying local. God was doing that before the liberal progressive marketers got a hold of that.
So powerful. So powerful. What do you think prevents us from doing that? From sort of being as leaders often, and I'm going to say in the church, right? What I see is we sort of look past the local and our people and our neighborhood. And maybe it's all that celebritization, just to continue working with your word there, Bill. But what do you see? What do you, in your experience, what have you seen get in the way of that kind of potent local work?
Well, I could just say very briefly, I think, Kathi, and I have to remind myself that the local granular work of caring for people is very holy. So what I'm trying to remember when I go through the work of a pastor is every eulogy I preach reminds us of the sanctity and holiness of human life. Every hospital visitation. I think that media and the ways that people project images from the media that's at our hands, it continues to devalue, undervalue the local by compressing cultures, compressing language, making one stereotypical way of viewing vast swaths of complex people. It really, I think that, and I also think that it's hard work that we want to avoid. Community is hard work. Community is messy work. What I think about when I would argue about with myself about how important the local pastoral work is, because we're talking to pastors. It's grueling work. It's thankless work. It doesn't pay well. It's society does not value it. But the thing to know about staying rooted in place is this: the text says that you shall be like a tree planted by the waters. The tree that is planted by the waters flourishes. The tree that jumps from river to river will never grow. So you got to get to a place and be planted. And what I have learned is I am a better pastor when I am planted in the space and I learn from the people. I don't go teaching them about the space that I've been assigned to. I go learning from the space. I tell every pastor, especially in the Methodist itinerant system, the best thing you can do when you get moved to a place is to find the best history of that local space, to read about the forces and people that help to shape the space, so you will understand that you are not coming to a space where they've been waiting on you to fix the problems. You enter a stream of human interaction and you learn from that space and you listen and you can make with your people contributions that help that space to flourish.
Yeah.
I would start with this great seminary word of theological anthropology. We'll engage in uh, uh, a variety of theological and uh, academic theory around a variety of things, soteriology, ecclesiology, we'll throw all of those. The thing that we tend to run away from is theological anthropology. We struggle with how do we understand God's relationship to humanity? And I think we struggle with it because because it forces us to come to grips with um, the way that we treat people is a reflection of how we think God treats people. And so if we believe that God has a hierarchy, then we will behave and we will make decisions about our interactions with one another based on whether or not we believe God has a hierarchy. We may not intentionally say that out loud, but it forms but our understanding of that forms who we are. Just real quickly, it, it has been quite interesting to me to hear the prayers of those who were part of the January 6th resurrection and invoke the name of Jesus. There's something about how they understand who Jesus is and who God is and how God sees humanity that help them make the choices that they made that day. So that also is so that I think in a less dramatic and traumatic way is how we also engage people in our communities as well. How we understand our theological anthropology determines how we make a decision on how we interact with folk. If we believe that all of God's people have sacred worth, then we make different choices about how we interact with folk. And so I want to call folk into truly examining and critically reflecting on how do I understand my theological anthropology, because that ought to then shape how I behave and how I interact and how I really do engage neighbor. Because now that I'm thinking about it and we're speaking it out, the lawyer who asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" asked the theological anthropological question: How can I make a decision about who's in and who's out?
So as you say those things, and I think about Kathi's question about what are the obstacles, it's so interesting that you go there, Reggie. I mean, not surprising because you are a theologian and an academic, and it is so grounded. I mean, it's right back to Bill's word about the scandalous particularity of the incarnation. I mean, and 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 it comes also back to formation, right? How we are formed, how we are shaped by the gospel, then helps us to show up in the world in a new way. And um, I'm 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 so inspired by the words that you all are offering and the challenge. I'm inspired and I'm challenged by your words and witness. Um, all right, I think we're going to move to rapid fire. Is that where you're
It
going,
is, but I
Kathi?
just wanted to echo what you said, Lisa. You both remind us, and you particularly in that last response, Reggie, I think that how we do what we do in that theological anthropology reveals what's inside of us. I love the way you pull us back to examining what are our core convictions that are revealed in the way we deal with place and people and everything else that we do. And that's the formation I think that Lisa's talking about. And I just think that's so true in an uncomfortable way. Right? Just like, yeah, so revealing. We can get in this little close to the end part of our time together sort of short answer, rapid fire questions. And so I have just a series of these questions, which are only marginally related to all of our conversation that's come before. But I hope you'll find them kind of fun opportunity to talk a little more. So the first question is, and in some ways I feel like you've both already answered this, but let me ask you anyway. The first question to you is, just briefly, what's the first thing that you think a pastor coming into a new community, a new congregation, a new place can do to focus their own site and their congregations on the place, the neighborhood, the community where they're located? Just one thing.
I would say gather your people and listen to their stories about the place. Gather and deeply listen.
Ditto what Bill said, and I would also say take them through a Bible study of the Gospels and ask the question. It was colloquial at one time, but what did Jesus do that we're now called to go and do likewise?
Thank you both. Okay, number 2. Here's a sentence to complete. At this moment, when this country is so polarized and divisive, being the church looks like what?
It looks like helping this nation, if it wants to be helped, to give birth to democracy, which has never existed here.
If I could change it just a little, it ought to look like an opportunity to be a third space where we can have loving and honest dialogue and model that.
Maybe so.
And the third and final question, what do you think is the greatest challenge the church faces in the next decade?
To believe and to ethically embody that every human being is made in the image and likeness of God.
To wrestle with and fully understand what does it mean to be a disciple. We think we know what discipleship is, but I don't think we do.
Okay, well, every one of those short answers deserves an hour of podcast.
Exactly. Exactly what I was thinking. Oh, we could dig into that. Right. So thanks for playing our rapid fire. And you all were actually pretty good at keeping it rapid. It doesn't always end up that way, but so appreciate that. So we do have a final question. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Bill.
Really, we don't think a lot about Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity, and neither iterations of the faith has been as faithful as it are. But the Eastern Christian idea of theosis, that God has become human so that humans might become divine. The Western church doesn't like that kind of thinking, that kind of wrestling, that the divine embodies, imbues, plays within humans and in human spaces. I think we've got to understand from the East that the purpose of faith is for us to gain unity with the divine, such that our actions flow from the actions of the divine. We love like the divine. We share, we embody community like the divine. We are afraid of that in the West because I think the Western church won't have conversations about relinquishing control because part of its ethos, unwritten, is that the faith is leveraged to control bodies and spaces. So it
Mm,
polices that kind of pneumatological surrender.
mm. Wow. It polices it. It's almost like we've fallen off the other side of the horse, if you will, and aren't finding that place of sort of that non-dualistic balance where we hear the gospel and challenge ourselves. Um, wow. Okay. Again, we could spend a whole other hour on that piece alone and what that looks like in the church and how that shows up in our relationships as well as in the institution of the church, right? And the organizational structure of the church and what that has meant for us. So, again, Bill and Reggie, you have challenged us to the edges of our faith and work together. So there is a final question we're asking all of our guests this season. Kenda Creasy Dean says that when she thinks about the future of the church, she doesn't see a big thing coming, but rather she sees a lot of small boats. And we do talk about that in our episode with Kenda this season. But what is a small boat that you see that gives us a glimpse of the future church?
In a hopeful way.
Yes, ideally in a hopeful way. Thank you.
So let me preface my small boat with an understanding that I really am trying to help folk think about and embrace. And that is the disciples were not old men.
Mm.
They were teenagers. That the oldest one amongst them was Peter, and he was probably around 21. Jesus himself, and his ministry is recorded at between 30 and 33. For whatever reason, this whole movement was placed in the hands of teenagers.
Wow.
And the
Got
small
chills, Reggie.
boat is, if we really and truly listen to our young people, they can guide and lead us. They can continue to guide and lead us. Every major movement and that has happened in our world has been led by young people. Civil rights movement, they were all young adults, except for some old, some other elders that walked alongside. Young adults. Tiananmen Square, all young people. Every major movement in our societies have taken place through the Birmingham Children's Movement during the Civil Rights Movement that turned the tide of what's going on. And so the small boat is offering and allowing our young people to set the next agenda for the church.
Yeah. Bill, a
There is
small boat?
nothing to be said to I'm in Reggie's small boat. I think that he is spot on.
Yeah.
I'm going to get in. Yeah, I hope your small boat has a motor, a little outboard, but yeah, I'm in your small boat.
Bless you, sir.
Nice, nice. You too. Gosh, this is what gives me hope for the church's witness today and into the future is faithful, deeply, deeply faithful leaders and servants like you two. Thank you. Thank you for what you do every day. Thank you for being part of the ministry that we get to be a part of. I'm so grateful to both of you.
And thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you all so much.
Such a
Yeah,
pleasure to
and
be
we
with you.
celebrate the wonderful work. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.